The war between Ukraine and Russia is now heading into its fourth month, and the fierce battles continue in the eastern region of Ukraine as Ukrainian President Zelensky visited the front. Now, to discuss the war in more details is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, who joins us now from Los Angeles. Lisa, Zelensky made a rare frontline visit to Kharkiv, the country's second largest city, to assess the strength of the national defense. How's it looking for the Ukrainian forces?
You know, it's interesting. The fact that we say this has been going on for 4 months is crazy. It's crazy that the Ukrainians have been able to hold on for this long. If we had talked about this, months before this started, we would have thought this wouldn't have even lasted 4 days. If you put the might of the Russian military side by side with the Ukrainians, it's not even, it's not a question or a conversation to be had. Now, the fact that the Ukrainians have been able to hold on for this long doesn't give us any indication as to whether or not they'll be able to hold on forever or how this will end. The most important factor here is how the Russians will decide to end this and whether or not Vladimir Putin feels like he has some sort of an off-ramp, meaning will he escalate things to really have this, grand finale of sorts? Will he resort to nuclear weapons, chemical weapons? Will he, just back down and say, we've done enough here to take over X, Y, and Z provinces, areas, and, then leave it alone? Or, as some reports indicate, is he sick and not want to carry this out, any further? We really don't know. And again, it comes down to it's in Russia's hands. It's not in Zelensky's hands. It's not in the US's hands. And as billions of dollars get poured into this here in the United States, it's always a conversation of comparisons, and to say we don't have money for this, but we gave 40 billion to the Ukrainians. We don't have money for this, but we're giving 40. And it's a valid point to say, for example, we don't have money for school security, but we're giving 40 billion to the Ukrainians. And the only reason I say it's a valid point is that do the Ukrainians truly have a chance? If they continue to have more weapons, if we give them more the latest technology, this morning I believe it was breaking news that Biden decided to give them even more in terms of technology and weapons. Where is this all going, and why are we putting in this investment into the Ukraine fight? So a lot of questions, not so many answers. And again, all of this comes down to what will Putin do next?
Lisa, European Union leaders are urging Russian President Putin to begin direct dialogue with Zelensky for peace in Ukraine. What would that conversation actually look like?
Right. And this has been from the beginning. Why don't they sit down and have a conversation? And Zelensky was always pushing for that. Now, that conversation will look like this. Putin will sit down. He'll make his list of requirements or concessions that he requires from the Ukrainians, and then I think once they commit to giving him those things, he'll probably ask for more, because that's the way he is. And from the beginning of this battle, he did sit down with Erdogan from Turkey and said, "Well, I want these 5 items," and the 5 items were things that the Ukrainians would have put up, but then things changed, and Putin said, I'm going to go for more. Look, it will require some of the land to be annexed back to Russia. It will require the denazification of Ukraine, which is what Putin has been. That's been his narrative from the get-go, that there are neo-Nazi influences inside Ukraine that have to be eradicated. That's a fair claim and a fair requirement. He will want the Russian language to be reinstated into Ukraine and not to be shunned. It's interesting to see, how Ukraine will respond to this. He will want there to be a demilitarization, particularly now as all this military equipment has been poured into Ukraine. He doesn't want that, obviously, on his doorstep. So Putin will probably want that again as well. Again, how will the international community respond to this? How quickly and how easily will they make this off-ramp readily available for Putin if he should sit down with Zelensky? And the final question then becomes, will Putin want to sit down with Zelensky anytime soon to put an end to this conflict once and for all?
And European leaders have failed to reach an agreement, Lisa, on banning Russian oil imports, which is jacking up the price of fuel even higher. Diplomats in Brussels struggle to clinch a last-hour compromise ahead of a European Council summit.
Yeah, they don't want to put in, they don't want to stop bringing in Russian oil, and it makes sense. The world economy is truly suffering, both the world economy in terms of oil, in terms of basic food prices, because of the wheat shortage, all sorts of supply shortages as a result of this. We're seeing it in the stock market, we're seeing it in the bonds market, we're seeing it in Bitcoin, we're seeing it all throughout, as it really makes its toll on the global economy. Now, the Europeans are dragging their feet as usual. But again, perhaps we can put an end to this before they have to even decide, because they have lagged and have not committed to banning Russian oil up to this point. Perhaps they might not have to if we do see talks, if we do see an end to this conflict sometime soon.
Now, Lisa, protesters in Iran are calling for the death of Iran's supreme leader, and they want to overthrow the government as well. The demonstrators are angry at the government's corruption and lack of human rights. It continues.
Yes, and thank you for giving this some airtime, Hal. I mean, this story has been going on. We're entering the third week of Iran protests, and the protesters are angry that they're not getting the global support that they deserve. All they're asking for is basic rights. And I know a lot of people think this is based on food prices, which it initially started out, that was the catalyst, but it quickly went to protesting the entire regime, saying that this is a corrupt regime. This regime is not capable of giving its civilians the basic needs that they need, like basic food supplies and basic medical supplies. And that's how it goes. How people don't dream of these lofty concepts of democracy and justice and liberty. What they do go to bed dreaming about is putting food on the table for their families. And once it gets to that point, that becomes the breaking point. That's when they flood the streets, and that's when they're willing to risk their lives, risk being shot at and being arrested by this government in order to have their voices heard. So we're trying to put this out into the mainstream media that's always reluctant to cover it, particularly now, because as we know, the West and the Biden administration and the Europeans are very gung-ho on getting a nuclear deal. So they don't want to upset that with the narrative that the Iranian people are upset with this government, the same government that we're trying to normalize relations with. So we're having trouble really getting this out into the mainstream media, and we want to get the voices of the Iranian people heard. There are a ton of citizen journalists on the ground there, so we have no excuses that we cannot get a reporter on the ground in Tehran or Khuzestan, which is in the southwest region of Iran. There are a lot of protests there, but it's throughout the country, and people are really angry. They want the world to know their grievances.
Lisa, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett sent out a warning to Iran that its terrorist-sponsoring immunity days are over. Now, the message comes after a week that saw an Iranian colonel assassinated and an Iranian engineer killed in a military complex, both actions reportedly attributed to Israel.
Yes, and attributed to Israel through leaks by the U.S. We reported this on the Foreign Desk as breaking news this week. A colonel was killed. He was from the Revolutionary Guard, a very high up colonel, was shot in front of his house by silenced bullets. Then there was a report that was leaked to the New York Times that Israel admitted to the United States that they took this guy out as a symbolic hit to the Revolutionary Guard for continuing on their nuclear program, continuing to make threats against Israel, and continuing their human rights abuses in Iran. Now, why that was leaked to the New York Times, we don't know. But if you recall, during the Obama administration, there was also a leak when Bibi Netanyahu told Obama that they were planning on taking out nuclear reactors in Iran as a targeted strike. And that was, again, leaked to the media by the Obama administration at that time. So it's very unfortunate that we have these leakers, and that this is not a quid pro quo, a reciprocated relationship between Israel and the United States, as it always has been in the past 5 decades. But you have a situation here on our hands where Israel has to watch its own back, and for that reason, they're saying this is a situation where we don't have to give immunity to these leaders anymore. We will take them out as we see fit, as to defend ourselves the way we have to defend ourselves.
Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard is apparently building a massive new support ship near the Strait of Hormuz as it tries to expand its naval presence. Lisa, how much of a threat will this really be to us here in the West?
It's always a threat. Look, it's a threat because we've closed our eyes to the expansion of the Iranian empire, and I don't even want to call it Iranian. It's more like the Islamic Republic's empire. So they will continue chest thumping. They will continue on their parades. They will continue testing missiles. They'll continue enriching uranium, and they will do whatever they can. Look, if you want to compare the 2015 Obama era nuclear talks to the ones we have now, at that time, at least there was this facade of we will behave, we're gonna change our ways, and we want to get this deal to go through. And now you have such an about face where the Iranian regime, they know they're going to get this deal. They know that the West wants it very badly, spearheaded by Biden and the European Union, and they know that they can get away with literally murder. So they will continue making their threats against Israel. They will continue with their presence in the surrounding areas. They'll continue sending money to Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen and Syria, and the list goes on, because they don't have to change their ways. And that is very telling of the foreign policy environment that the Biden administration has created. And when we have this lack of security, it means a lack of security for all. It trickles down for everybody. And that is something to be very, very concerned about right now.
Lisa, the U.S. State Department has been quietly mediating talks between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt on negotiations that could be a good first step toward normalizing relations between the larger Arab countries and the Jewish state. Tell me more.
Yeah, so we had the Abraham Accords under President Trump that brought the moderate Arab nations to a relationship, an economic and otherwise relationship with Israel. And now we've been always wondering whether Saudi Arabia, the godfather of all the Arab nations, would also join in the Abraham Accords, likewise Egypt. And now we know that there have been talks between these two countries and the United States. Of course, some bartering going on. These islands must be returned to Saudi Arabia. That's what they had stipulated as a part of this deal. But this is very important. We know that Saudi Arabia gave their nod, gave their blessing to the smaller Arab nations to normalize relations with Israel in the Abraham Accords. But we were waiting on seeing if this would pan out for the larger Arab states. And now we see that perhaps it will. We've never seen the Biden administration give any credit or kind of acknowledge the benefit of the Abraham Accords. If anything, they would belittle it and talk about how it has no bearing on our foreign policy. So now we see that if they are continuing this line of negotiations with Arab states and Israel, then they are understanding the value and the assets of having these Arab nations grow closer to Israel. And of course, as we know, this is in retaliation to kind of combat the growing threat of Iran's influence in the region. It's not any love affair with Israel, but rather the enemy of my enemy sort of foreign policy going on here.
But let me ask you something. I mean, this war between the Arabs and the Jews has been going on for centuries. How can there really be trust and a foundation be developed in this regard?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And really, if we look at the evolution of the Middle East and we look at where we are now, the Arab Spring told us a lot about the change in the people and the area. And that was to say that the people outgrew these outdated tropes about, the Jews are our enemy. No, maybe the Jews can teach us a thing or two about water irrigation, about apps, about technology, about security. And they want those things for themselves. So when they look at a thriving nation like Israel in the Middle East, a country the size of New Jersey that has more technologies we bring in, the United States brings in Israel for many technologies. If you go into any hospital, you look at any cell phone, you look at any laptop, you have all sorts of technologies from Israel. And well, the nations of the Arab world look at that and say, well, we want a piece of that. Instead of sticking to these old tropes that are from biblical times, we don't want to have any enemies. We'd rather have some profit. We'd rather have prosperity. And that's really the brainchild of the Trump administration to say, they have more in common than not. Let's focus on the economic prosperity that these countries could have if they come together rather than to fight their old ways. And that's exactly what happened. And the proof is in the pudding. You don't have just a piece of paper or a lousy signature that tells us that this is a bogus deal. If you look at the UAE and Israel, for example, you have weddings going on, religious Orthodox Jewish weddings going on in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. You have a ton of reciprocation in terms of technology, deals, private and public. You have tourism going on, a lot of prosperity and a lot to share between the two nations. So I think a lot of the Arab nations are looking at this and saying, we want a piece of the action as well. And they're coming forward to sign on.
Lisa, many people have tuned into the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. Have you been watching the drama unfold? What's the latest?
Getting some of the summaries here. So over the weekend, they did not get a verdict, so they stopped at final testimonies, and we're waiting to see who's going to win this. As you know, Johnny Depp is going for $50 million against Amber Heard for defamation for an op-ed that she wrote against him, saying that he was very violent and abused her, and she's countersuing him for $100 million, saying this is all in defamation. It's an important lawsuit, Hal, even though it looks like just Hollywood shenanigans, which it is to a certain point. It's a question of freedom of speech when it comes down to it. How free are we to make our speech? Can we just claim things about people that are true or might not be true? The fact that she was allowed to write an op-ed, I mean, anyone can do this. And we had the Me Too movement here in the United States that really it changed the times. It almost made it as though every woman who comes out is a victim. Every woman should be believed, and certain times they're not to be believed. They do. I mean, any human being, male or female, regardless of gender, is capable of lying to push forward their narrative and their agenda. So in this case, did she have an agenda? Well, that will be for the jury to decide. 5 men and 2 women to decide whether it was defamation on her part or defamation on his to kind of bring this lawsuit. So it's important. I think it's important because it'll put something on the map in terms of, are all women victims to be believed, or can we start to question these narratives the way we should in the court of law, hearing both sides, bringing in all sorts of experts. I mean, from ABC, Disney executives that were brought in to say, did they truly lose, jobs because of this, or potential roles in movies because of this op-ed that was written? So I think it's very important to see how this comes about, and I think it will really set a precedent in terms of these types of lawsuits.
U.S. correspondent and foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari, thanks so much for joining us today from Los Angeles.
My pleasure.